Welcome back to Talking Europe. My guest today is President Trump's man in Brussels. Gordon Sondland is the US ambassador to the European Union, a post he has held since early July of this year. Like his boss, he's a hotel magnate, but he is seen as a mainstream Republican who has raised money for traditional conservative candidates in the past. He's come into the job at a particularly fraught time in US-EU relations, particularly on trade. This is his first long interview to a European broadcaster since taking on this role. Ambassador Sondland, thank you very much for being my guest today.
Thank you, Armin. It's great to be here.
Let's start with the general tone in the transatlantic relationship. We're faced here in Europe with an unprecedented situation where a US president has called the EU a foe. How does that affect your job here? Does it make it very difficult?
Well, Armin, I'm sad to say that I'm the ultimate transatlanticist with having two parents born in Europe, being the first US-born child of those two parents. I would say the president's characterization as an economic foe is probably spot on, even though we are allies in many other senses.
But it's not only economic, is it? Because if you look at his friends in Europe, people like Nigel Farage, or the fact that his ambassador, you mentioned your family history, his own ambassador in Berlin came out with comments that were openly in favor of the AfD, the alternative for Germany. There's something cultural and political here. It's not only about the economic relationship, is it? I mean, how much does he really not like the EU? What sense do you get when you talk to him?
Well, it's really not about liking or disliking the EU. The sense I get is that while the relationship is long and deep, and the United States has for decades supported the EU both militarily, both in terms of beginning, frankly, with the Marshall Plan, we don't really get credit for that when it comes to trade issues. The President has long said that the current trade imbalance in goods, including all of the non-tariff barriers that are currently up, need to come down, and that trade balance needs to go down as well. And when we ask the Europeans, for lack of a better term, to cut us a little slack and work with us on this, hoping to lean on that long-standing relationship and all of the things we've done for Europe, we're not seeing a lot of love coming back. We're seeing very, very hard-nosed, tough negotiations that require us to respond in kind.
Do you expect that there will be a crisis with tariffs being slapped on European cars? Because that's a huge issue at the moment, isn't it? Do you think that's going to happen soon?
Well, I can tell you the President tried to engage with the Europeans almost from the moment he was inaugurated in January of 2017. It was not until he imposed the tariffs on steel and aluminum that Europe returned the phone call.
If there were to be US sanctions on European cars, there would be retaliation at a time when, let's not forget, General Motors has just shut some plants in those Rust Belt areas that Mr. Trump needs to win in the next presidential election. Doesn't sound like very smart politics if you think of a longer-term approach.
Well, listen, if President Trump was only about smart politics, it would be very easy for him to fall in the footsteps of his predecessors, and I'm speaking of multiple predecessors, not just his immediate predecessor, and have a lot of nice, friendly meetings with Europe, a lot of great meals, some great photo opportunities, and no progress. He is bound and determined to fundamentally fix the structure that currently exists, both in Europe and in China, vis-a-vis the US.
How realistic is it, though, to get a free trade deal now? I mean, a sort of TTIP minus, because you're obviously asking, your side is asking for a lot of things to be on the table: agriculture, digital tax, throwing all of this in the pot. That just sounds like a recipe for complete gridlock and even worsening relations. I mean, both sides are not going to get all of these issues either, are they? Why not just focus on something much more narrow?
Well, the President has approached this in a couple of ways. The first approach was, let's drop all non-tariff barriers to trade on both sides of the Atlantic. let's drop all tariffs and let's drop all subsidies. And in the short term, that would mean there would be some winners and losers on both sides of the Atlantic. But after a short period of time, the best products would win the market and there would be equilibrium.
But best products, for example, if we take cars, let's be honest, American cars are not massively popular in Europe, so you'd be willing to take that risk that actually even fewer cars would be imported potentially from the US?
You know, Armin, the free market and capitalism is a wonderful thing. If the American car manufacturers had complete free access to the European market, just as the Europeans would have equal access to the American market, and they were shipping cars to Europe that Europeans didn't want to buy, they would quickly have to figure out what to do to those cars to make them appealing to Europeans.
I see your point. Let's talk a bit about, as we are France 24, this relationship between President Trump and Emmanuel Macron, which seems to have gone spectacularly wrong. When you see these tweets just after the armistice commemorations, or indeed the most recent one that President Trump came out with about the massive and violent protests in France, do you get the sense he's really turned on France now? What's your reading of all this?
I think President Trump, like any successful business person, is always skeptical. I think the proof is in the pudding. I think there are things in which we are working beautifully together with France. And there are some things where we and the French do not see eye to eye. And I think the president is extremely pragmatic and is taking them issue by issue.
Let's, well, proof is in the pudding, or perhaps in the drinking, because, of course, President Trump's comments on wine sales has caused a lot of ructions in France. Is this trading arrangement really unfair? What is the reality of taxes on wine? Let's take a closer look with this report.
American enophiles are worried they may soon have a harder time buying French wines in the United States. This after U.S. President Donald Trump suggested American wines are too heavily taxed in France.
On trade, France makes excellent wine, but so does the U.S. The problem is that France makes it very hard for the U.S. to sell its wines in France and charges big tariffs, whereas the U.S. makes it easy for French wines and makes very small tariffs. Not fair, must change.
According to the California-based Wine Institute, the EU's import tariff on U.S. wine ranges from 11 to 29 cents per bottle, while the U.S. charges between 5 and 14 cents per bottle. President Trump is then correct to say that France, via the European Union, imposes higher tariffs on wine than the U.S. does to French wines. This Washington wine vendor is worried steeper tariffs on imported wines would put a dent in his business.
We have 25 to 30% of French wines, and if the tariffs have been put on that, definitely it's going to slow down the sale. And here we are approaching the holiday season, it's going to slow down the sales in the holiday season.
French winemakers are also anxious about Trump's possible next moves. In 2017, the U.S. was the single largest importer of French wines, accounting for 1.6 billion euros of sales.
So, Ambassador, we saw in that report that wine seller in the U.S. saying that French wine constitute 20 to 30% of his sales. If there's retaliation, if there's a kind of trade war, that's not going to be good for his business. It's not good for small American businesses. It's not good for jobs, ultimately, when he may have to start firing some people. You'd say, well, that's just how it is. It's a price to pay for making a broader point about trade.
Well, I go back to what I said earlier. The president's ultimate goal is to drop all of these trade barriers on both sides. And trust me, when the barriers come down, there will be as many American businesses complaining about their loss of protectionism as there will be European businesses. That's just the nature of protectionism. People get used to it, they build their business model around it, and all of a sudden when the emperor has no clothes and their products and services need to fight for placement in the market in terms of quality, pricing, innovation, that's when the true winners and losers are exposed. And I think that the president is willing to take that political heat as long as there's no cherry picking, which was one of the problems with TTIP. If everything comes down and it's a full and free and balanced trade relationship, then to go back to your point about cars, if one of the Detroit car manufacturers complains to the president and says, we can't sell cars to Europe, his first question will be, well, can you not sell them to Europe because the Europeans won't allow you to sell them, or is it because Europeans don't want to buy them? And if the answer is the latter, he will probably say that's your problem. You need to figure out a better solution.
Let's come on to some other issues. As I said in our introduction, you're seen as a mainstream Republican. There's a COP24 summit opening in Katowice in Poland. Do you think that it really has any credibility now that the US is going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement?
With the president, this isn't about climate change. This is about unilateral economic disarmament. That's his real problem with Paris. It's not that he's arguing about climate change. He's arguing about what is everyone going to do at the same time.
I think he is also arguing about climate change. I mean, the latest statement about what happened to global warming just because of a particular cold spell, which scientists obviously ridiculed. But you don't share that skepticism that he has on global warming itself.
Well, I think he said the climate gets colder and the climate gets warmer, and I don't really have any scientific basis to dispute that.
Just some other issues, Mr. Ambassador. We're hearing in the last few days that France and Germany might jointly host a special purpose vehicle to get round US sanctions on Iran.
Lovely.
A new development. You've said, or you've been on record with saying, I wouldn't touch the special purpose vehicle with a barge pole. Would you touch it if it was with two countries, and would they be able to withstand pressure from the US if it was France and Germany together acting on this?
Look, the special purpose vehicle is only as good as those companies and countries that avail themselves of it. We've had extraordinary success around the globe, with a few exceptions that you know who they are, in talking to global businesses who have no interest in falling into the bad graces of the US so that they can do business with Iran. So they can create all the special vehicles they want. They're useless.
So you wouldn't hesitate, you don't think your administration would hesitate to punish both countries, France and Germany, if they found a way to territorially host this special purpose vehicle?
Well, it's not about the host, it's about the user.
Right.
And we've made it very clear that any business can do business with Iran. They can also do business with the United States, but they can't do business with both.
And just to come back to that earlier decision to exempt some European countries from those sanctions, was that an attempt to divide the EU, as commentators on this side of the Atlantic said? So, for example, Greece would not vote against the US in the European Council because it got an exemption, so it's in the good graces of your president?
No, the sanctions were very, very carefully designed, and there were exemptions given for very specific technical reasons. They were not given as a political cudgel, they were given for technical reasons. And the Treasury Department worked long and hard on those.
What about the European defense idea? Do you think that's a goer, or is it just Macron public relations? The idea of a common European defense force?
That's a very problematic thing for us, and the problems are manifold. First of all, no one really knows what the Europeans have in mind, because I'm not even sure the Europeans agree on what they define as European defense. We've heard both bookends, one from Macron saying that he wants to build up essentially a full European army and all that that means. And then the other extreme is that it is essentially nothing more than a small security force designed to act in operations that NATO would not be involved in, or operations in Africa or elsewhere. And we've encouraged the Europeans, whether we agree or not, to come up with a very specific list of what they intend to do and how they intend to spend the money.
If that money, though, I mean, if the concept could be made clearer, would your administration be all right with the idea of a more muscular intervention force, providing that it doesn't take away it doesn't undermine spending on NATO.
That's the key. It cannot undermine spending on NATO, and it has to be complementary with NATO, and NATO would have to sign off on it because only NATO knows what its long-term plans are. And of course, ironically, most of the member countries who would set something like that up are also members of NATO. So,
Ambassador, one final point on Brexit. Your president has recently been on the record as saying he doesn't believe that the current withdrawal agreement between Britain and the EU would open the way for a free trade deal between the US and the UK. Is that your analysis as well?
What he's saying is that he wants to make sure that the UK is in a position as quickly as possible to do a free trade deal with the United States. I think he's made it clear that the that the UK would be first in line, given all of the things that the US currently has on its plate. But he wants the UK to never put itself in a position where it cannot act in its own best interests.
So if it stays in the customs union indefinitely, is that a deal breaker, do you think?
A deal breaker for whom?
For the US to do a free trade deal with the UK?
Well, we can only do a free trade deal with the UK when the UK is legally positioned to make such a deal, with us or with anyone else.
Yeah. We'll have to end it there. Thank you so much for being
my
guest
Thank
on
you.
covering such a wide array of topics. Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the US ambassador to the European Union here in Brussels. That's all we have time for. Do join us again very soon for another edition of Talking Europe.